Well, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome, bienvenue to the delegation of the Ismaili Imamate. It's always a great pleasure to welcome you all here for another one of our conversations about Canada and the world. When this building was inaugurated by His Highness the Aga Khan and the Prime Minister 2 years ago, or 2.5 years ago now, they expressed a common sentiment that we should convene here those conversations that would lift our aspirations for the kind of contribution that we might make to a more peaceful, prosperous, and pluralist world. And we have, over the last 2.5 years, explored many themes along that line. And recently, we have turned our attention to the question of diplomacy, and diplomacy in the 21st century. How is it that the new actors that are emerging, the new economic and political power dynamics, the more and more complex global issues, how is it that those trends should change the way we do diplomacy, and who should make those changes? We are absolutely thrilled and honored that we have Anne-Marie Slaughter here to help us think through some of those issues. She needs, of course, very little introduction to this audience here. She is, as you know, among the most imaginative and perceptive observers of how the changes in the world implicate diplomacy and foreign policy. A thoughtful and humane scholar, she is a remarkable and energetic teacher. I can say that from firsthand experience. A very skilled foreign policy practitioner as well. In addition to teaching at the University of Chicago Law School and the Woodrow Wilson School, the University of Chicago Law School and the Harvard Law School, she was also dean at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton, and she has just finished 2 years as head of the policy planning staff at the U.S. Department of State, where she led the first ever, and let me see if I'm going to get this right, quadrennial diplomacy and development review, better referred to as the QDDR, which was really a unique and first ever comprehensive assessment of the U.S. government's integrated foreign policy and development priorities in the face of a rapidly changing world. So just fresh off of that assignment, she has agreed to come and share some of her thoughts with us. I have to say, we are equally delighted to have as our moderator for this evening, Arif Lalani. As most of you here will know, Arif is probably most well known for his distinguished tenure as Canada's ambassador to Afghanistan during a very eventful time in Canada's engagement in that country. He is currently the head of the policy planning staff at the Department of Foreign Affairs and International Trade. We're going to invite Professor Slaughter to address you, and then Arif will moderate a conversation first between him and Professor Slaughter, and then involving all of you. So ladies and gentlemen, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Professor Anne-Marie Slaughter.
Thank you. Thank you. I always love coming to Canada and have spent many years of my life as a scholar, particularly as an international lawyer, praising innovations that have, in my view, been far more often pioneered by Canada than by the United States. So it's always very nice for me to be able to come and find out what's being thought about here as well as south of the border. I taught a class on national security policy this year. I left the State Department at the end of January and found myself back in a classroom 4 days later. And once I got my sea legs as a teacher again, we taught a seminar on national security policy. And one of the classes, when I knew that my students needed a break from reading, I showed them the movie 13 Days. Now, I don't know how many of you, if any of you have seen it, but 13 Days is a quite accurate historical account of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It focuses on the 13 days of the Cuban Missile Crisis. It focuses almost entirely on what was happening in the ExComm, the Executive Committee in the White House, with actors obviously playing President Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy and the members of the military, the men and they were all men, who made those decisions. It's a very gripping movie. It kept my students awake. It brings home the magnitude and how close we came to the possibility of nuclear war, which frankly for my students is just unimaginable, and may it remain so. But after the movie, I said, so what struck you the most, other than the fact that everybody smoked, everybody drank, and there were no visible women in any policy-making positions? And the students had very interesting reactions, and fortunately, that was why I wanted them to see the movie and why I'm starting with this today. They said, well, there were only 2 countries in the world. From the perspective of the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was the United States and the Soviet Union. No other country is ever mentioned in the movie, and I do think it's pretty accurate. Obviously, Cuba and the OAS, but in terms of the key players, it's the United States and the Soviet Union. At one point, one of the advisors says to the president, well, China invaded India today, but I don't think you want to hear about that. That's true. China did invade India in October of 1962. It was a complete footnote. You imagine today if China invaded India. The other things the students said was that it was all government to government, and there were no direct channels of communication. So there was no mention of social ties, economic ties, NGOs, business community, any of the people today who would be engaged at least around in sort of outside the immediate circle in a crisis of that magnitude. And there was not even a direct hotline between the president of the United States and Khrushchev and the Soviet Union. The hotline was put in after that. So it was essentially, 2 players staring at each other, figuring out what the other was going to do. And at the end, and it's a famous line about the Cuban Missile Crisis, Dean Russ says, we were eyeball to eyeball, and the other guy just blinked. I start with that because that is the traditional paradigm of foreign policy, international relations. It is a game with a very limited number of players. It is essentially a chess game. It can be modeled as different kinds of games. That's what game theory is all about. This was a game of chicken. We were heading straight at each other, and somebody moved off the road, fortunately, or blinked. It's a game that is mostly about military power, either the use of it or the threat of it, and it is entirely played by governments. That is still the paradigm for maybe not most, but I'd certainly say the majority of the writing, the reporting, and the academic thinking about foreign policy. And it is still in government, and I just come out of government. It's the prestigious part of foreign policy. When there's a crisis with North Korea or a crisis with China or with Iran, you get a small group of people around the table, you think about what the other government's going to do, less smoking, less drinking, but that's still that vision of a high-level, high-stakes poker with another government is still the image of the core of foreign policy. So I want to start with that, and then I want to give you 2 other images that are much more recent in vintage, and then I want to talk about what I think those 3 together mean for how we have to do diplomacy. So fast forward to 2001, to September 11th. And I will apologize, obviously my examples are American-centric, but I think in this case, many of us, many countries around the world had similar perceptions. So 9/11 is it's the opposite end of the spectrum from the Cuban Missile Crisis. As someone who lived through it, and I was in Cambridge at the time, and you had no idea who was on the other end. It was the opposite of sort of eyeball to eyeball and the other guy just blinked. You didn't know who the other guy was, and you didn't know why it was happening other than generically it was terrorism. You didn't know how long it might continue, who was going to get hit. In my case, I thought, well, you know, they've struck the financial center in the United States, they struck the Pentagon, they were clearly aiming for the political center if they were going to strike Congress. For all I know, they're going to try to strike different segments of society. If that includes academia, you really don't want to be in Cambridge, Massachusetts. I mean, I say that only because that sense of just really, it could strike anywhere, and it wasn't another government. And of course, it wasn't a government. It was a terrorist network. It was hosted by a government, as we've just had occasion to remember. But fundamentally, we could not respond in any of the ways we responded in the Cuban Missile Crisis, other than finally to tell another government that they couldn't host a terrorist network, and obviously then ultimately to take military action to dislodge them. But, as is the nature of networks, the minute you do that in one place, the network pops up in another. So although right now we're all focused on the capture of Osama bin Laden, we well know that the real danger of al-Qaeda has moved probably to Yemen, to North Africa, and of course it has struck in many different places around the world. So it's not governments, it's non-state actors. It's non-state actors that are connected across many, many different countries. And it can't be modeled according to any kind of a game. We might be able to use network theory, but that's vastly different than this sort of classic limited multi-nation game. So that's 9/11, and of course, when we talk about terrorist networks, that really invited us to look at the underside of globalization more generally. You look at terrorist networks, but you know, if you're in Mexico, the violence that you might experience in Afghanistan is not all that different in many places, in the sense of being worried about sending your kids to school, having your basic life disrupted, but that comes from an international narcotics network, an international criminal narcotics network, international money laundering networks, international arms trafficking networks, international networks trafficking in people, women, children, migrants more generally. So the first decade of this century has been much more about those non-state networked threats, very different than the traditional government-to-government model. Then move to today. So now we're in the midst of the Arab Spring. There again, we're talking about non-state actors, but we're looking at events where we really can't predict how long they'll go on, where they're popping up, how sustainable they are. They are networks of social activists, political activists, digital and actual. We know that the Egyptian activists had been talking to the Tunisians, and of course the Bahrainis and the Syrians had then had contact with the Egyptians. What is a little less well known is that many of those activists, certainly including the Tunisians, had been in touch with the Serbians who dislodged Slobodan Milosevic, this group called Otpor, which was very effective in Serbia after Milosevic was ousted. They, with the support of a number of foundations, that's part of this, how you get your funding, how you actively connect with like-minded people across borders. They had held seminars on how you take a 70,000-person Facebook page and turn it into an actual street demonstration. It's not as simple as just saying, you know, let's meet tomorrow. There's a whole host of psychological techniques, of practical techniques, and those were transmitted through networks that are far more positive, at least in many cases, than the non-state terrorist or criminal networks that we've been talking about. That's a model going forward that I would say is every bit as powerful an actor in world events as negative non-state networks as well. And in our diplomacy in the United States, we were caught a little flat-foot, right? We've been engaging with the governments, And we had to continue to engage with the governments, obviously with Hosni Mubarak in Egypt, but we had very little ability to engage directly with the protesters in the streets. We didn't have those contacts. We weren't sure how we could engage with them. So we're still in the government-to-government model primarily while we're watching these powerful forces that are networked in a positive way. Put all three of those together. The government-to-government model is still very relevant. I don't want to suggest that it's been displaced, it's just been complemented. But as I noted, if you have a crisis with North Korea or Iran, or you're thinking about US-Chinese relations, or for that matter, even within this hemisphere, of course, we still think about, conduct our foreign policy government to government in fairly limited ways. But at the same time, we now have a vast range of social actors. And I'm going to call them social actors. I'm not sure we have the right term, but non-state actors just underlines the fact that our paradigm hasn't actually evolved. Someone said to me recently, non-state actors, the term non-state actor is equivalent to calling an automobile a horseless carriage. So I'm going to call them social actors, and I'm going to talk about instead of talking about states, unitary states, I'm going to talk about governments and societies and think about how we engage governments on the one hand and societies on the other. We are now in a world in which we have to do both. We are, and for good, for ill, either for threats we want to counter or positive outcomes we want to achieve. So let me now talk about three implications of putting those three images together and moving from a world of states, and again, whether that's you're a practitioner of foreign policy and you're thinking about how you practice government-to-government relations, or you're an academic and you think about how you model the world in your head. Now we're thinking about a world in which you have governments and societies, and you have to think about the relations between those governments and societies and across them. If that's the model of the world, the first thing we need to do is actually elaborate and articulate that model in a way that can be applied as foreign policy practitioners. And that's not as easy as it sounds. I've just described it, but when you're actually in the midst of a crisis and you're in a decision-making forum and you have to figure out what you're going to do, we, foreign policymakers, still default to that Cuban Missile Crisis model. It's what they know. They think about what can we do vis-a-vis another government. They don't tend to think about what can we do vis-a-vis a set of social actors. Partly, that's hard. You don't know who to talk to. You don't know what you can do, and it's very hard to do things on short notice. But we have to articulate and spell out a model that allows us to think about governments and societies in a way that can be used in our academic writing, in our popular writing, and our decision-making writing. Second point, more concretely in terms of policy, thinking about the world this way means that development has to be as important as diplomacy. This is one of Secretary Clinton's, what she hopes will be one of her primary legacies. She came into office, and President Obama has made similar arguments, saying that development has to have equal primacy with diplomacy in the way we think about our foreign policy. That doesn't sound very revolutionary standing in Ottawa, but it does in Washington. The idea that if you're thinking about actors as societies as actors, as different sets of social actors, obviously you have to think about the conditions that affect ordinary people's lives. And if you just think about it another way, just think about I have a sort of list of the top 6 or 7 problems that used to keep me up at night, or the sort of overwhelming threats. Everyone's always asking government officials to prioritize threats. So I would say, well, all right, anything that could kill a couple million Americans or severely destabilize their lives, again, from the point of view of a US policymaker, will qualify. So start with non-proliferation, then talk about terrorists and the spread of violent extremism, the stability of the global economy, climate change, global pandemics, global resource scarcity, not just energy, but more broadly. All but non-proliferation have to be tackled from a development perspective as well as a diplomacy perspective, from changing health systems on the ground, changing energy uses on the ground, how resources are used, building stronger economies, if we think about the global economy, creating opportunities, if you're thinking about violent extremism. So whether you think about it conceptually as governments and societies, or you think about it from the perspective of specific problems, development has to become an equal pillar of our foreign policy, of our international relations. Again, at least in the United States, there's typically core foreign policy, which tends to be, again, more guns and bombs, more government to government, and then development, which is all too often still, even in 2011, thought of as a largely humanitarian or even charitable venture. That cannot continue. People like me who have been trained in general foreign policy have to know as much about development debates and how development and diplomacy intersect as people in the Cold War had to know about arms control. They weren't necessarily arms control specialists, and development is its own profession with its own expertise, but you had to know the basics of different weapon systems, how different arms control negotiations. You weren't credible otherwise. Going forward, you're going to have to be versed enough in development to understand how development and diplomacy intersect as equal pillars of civilian foreign policy. And the third implication is for our diplomacy itself. So development on the one hand, diplomacy on the other. The third D is defense, but that's not my lookout, at least today. Secretary Clinton talks about 21st century statecraft as diplomacy that is government to government, that's the traditional, government to society, and society to society, facilitated and orchestrated by governments. And what I want to talk a little bit about now is what that means. What is government to society diplomacy? Well, we've always had public affairs, public diplomacy, engaging societies in various ways, but that, again, at least in the United States, has been seen much more in terms of getting our message across and making sure people like us. We haven't been all that successful in that dimension, but that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about building relationships with different segments of society, just as you think of government-to-government diplomacy as building relationships with people in foreign governments, relationships that you can then build on or call on in times of need. If you think about government to society, the first thing that happens is you start thinking about different segments of society. You think about women. Government to government, you don't think about women. And it's not necessarily sexist. It's just you think about government to government. You're not thinking about any particular dimension of the society. But if you think of government to society, leaving out half that society doesn't make a lot of sense. You think of government to youth. We are building a youth strategy. We've been talking about it for quite a while. But believe me, as the Arab Spring broke, we had written countless papers on the youth bulge in Africa and the Middle East. 60% of the population of the Middle East and North Africa is under 30. You need a strategy that is aimed at reaching and building relationships with that demographic. That changes the technology you use. It changes whom you hire as FSOs. It changes how you staff your embassies. But beyond youth or women, thinking about science diplomacy, health diplomacy, entrepreneurs. We've done a tremendous amount of work thinking about how to actually reach out to groups of entrepreneurs in different societies. This is something the United States thinks we do fairly well. This is, again, a way of building relationships with a segment of society. And more broadly still, internet freedom. Thinking about if a government is trying to engage a society, and for many, many, many members of a society, they are increasingly living their lives online, then from the US point of view, taking a position on internet freedom, on internet rights, has to be a core part of your diplomacy, and it's something we spent quite a lot of time on. So think about government to society. But no matter how effectively we do that, we're one government trying to engage millions, indeed billions of people. Ultimately, that kind of diplomacy can only be conducted fully and thoroughly if what you're doing is connecting your society to the foreign society, or rather building on the connections that are already there. That means working with diasporas and facilitating diaspora connections back to their home countries, either for development purposes, for human rights purposes, for a whole range of building social and educational and human connections. It means working on public-private partnerships, and not just sort of an individual instance of working with a particular corporation or a particular foundation, but actually orchestrating collaborative networks where if you think in the health area, if you think about the One campaign, or you think about HIV, AIDS, and the Global Fund, what works there is bringing together multiple corporations, multiple foundations, multiple NGOs, multiple health workers in various different places with governments into a much broader collaborative network that can tackle a particular problem. And one of the things Secretary Clinton did was to create the Global Partnership Initiative, really building on the kind of work former President Clinton's foundation does, again, bringing together multiple sectors of society to tackle specific problems. Finally, it really changes the way we think about the substance of diplomacy. And here I'll use a kind of development diplomacy. Instead of conducting programs ourselves, handing out funds, although people still love to have some government funds, but rather than handing out government funds and running a program, we increasingly, if we're thinking about society to society diplomacy facilitated by government, our role is to connect, to convene, to orchestrate, to use our embassies and indeed our agencies, this is the philosophy of the new head of the Agency for International Development, as a platform that can bring many other actors together. We have the legitimacy. We may not be seen as legitimate by everyone in the world, but for at least US citizens, they feel much more comfortable if they know it's the US Embassy who is connecting them to various people in a particular country, because they don't have that expertise. But simply using our funding, using our technology. Many of our embassies are becoming sources of really interesting information on places like Twitter, connecting different correspondents, different people who are using digital media, and then doing it much more physically in terms of building networks and groups who can tackle specific problems. So I hope I've given you some things to chew on. I want to just summarize briefly, and we'll continue this in the conversation. But in my lifetime, as someone both writing about and observing and now participating in foreign policy, we have seen this really dramatic shift from what was always a stylized vision of a world only of governments. It was never actually that, but it was good enough for government work. You could imagine that was a workable model of the world, the Cuban Missile Crisis model of the world, to a model of the world where suddenly we were focusing on non-state actors, but in much more negative ways, to today where we can actually develop a much more comprehensive vision of how to engage governments and societies together, government to government, government to society, and using governments to facilitate and strengthen and connect societies' connections with one another. That's a task that will certainly probably take us, certainly for the rest of my foreign policy career, but I actually think it's a very interesting and exciting time to be part of this, this enterprise. And the final thing I'll say, and perhaps the most valuable way of dimension of thinking about foreign policy this way, is that it is a vision of international relations and foreign policy that is no longer restricted to government practitioners. Everybody in this audience, everybody in my classes, anyone who wants to be engaged in tackling the business of solving global collective problems in one way or another actually has a role through society to society or society to government, or still in traditional government channels. So with that, I think I will open the floor.